Christmas is known for joy, laughter, and magical moments. But beneath the twinkling lights and cheerful carols lies a side of the season most people never see. What if I told you that the holidays could hold secrets so dark they would make you shiver? For some, Christmas is not a time of celebration, but a season of nightmares. Today, we'll uncover 5 horrifying true stories that will turn your festive cheer into cold dread. These tales will forever change the way you see the most wonderful time of the year. Brace yourself. This is going to get chilling. James had always been a man of logic. He was a successful businessman who prided himself on his ability to explain away the unexplainable. Ghosts? Superstitions? Folklore? James didn't believe in any of that. Christmas, for him, was just another day. But what happened to him one cold Christmas Eve would completely change his view of the world, and leave him questioning everything he once believed. It was late on Christmas Eve, and James was working late at his office in a high-rise building. The office was quiet. The city outside was covered in snow, with only the distant hum of traffic. Most people had already left for the holidays, but James stayed behind to finish some paperwork before taking a well-deserved break. As he sat at his desk, typing away, he heard something odd, a faint jingling of bells. At first, he thought it was just the sound of Christmas decorations in the building, or perhaps a wind chime from an adjacent office. But the sound grew louder and more distinct, as if it was right beside him. James paused, confused. He turned his chair, scanning the empty office. No one was there, but the jingling continued, closer now. He stood up, cautiously moving toward the hallway. That's when the temperature dropped. The air in the office became frigid, as if someone had opened a freezer door. James could see his breath in the air. His heart began to race as he felt a sudden unease. He turned to walk back to his desk, but then he froze. At the end of the hallway, just before the elevator, stood a figure. The figure was tall, draped in an old-fashioned coat with a high collar. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, and it stood motionless, as if waiting for something. James felt a wave of terror wash over him as he tried to speak, but no words came out. The figure began to move toward him slowly, and the jingling grew louder, almost deafening now. As the figure came closer, the air grew colder still. It moved without a sound, its feet never touching the floor. James's breath came in shallow gasps as the figure reached out, slowly, and touched his arm. The coldness was unbearable. The touch sent a shock through his entire body, freezing him in place. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. As soon as the figure touched James, the room seemed to shift. Time seemed to warp around him. The lights flickered, and James was transported. He found himself standing in a different place altogether. He was surrounded by snow with no signs of life, but the feeling of presence was overwhelming. He could hear the faint jingling of bells once more. The figure stepped back, and James suddenly found himself back in his office, as if no time had passed. The temperature returned to normal, and the bells stopped. James blinked, disoriented, and turned around, only to find that the figure was gone. He never saw the figure again, but every year on Christmas Eve, he could still hear the faint jingling of bells. To this day, James believes that the ghost of Christmas past had visited him, reminding him that some things in this world are beyond explanation, and that logic can never truly explain the things that happen in the dark. In a small town in the South, Christmas was always a time of joy and family. The Carters were no exception. 2 parents, a son, and a young daughter, Emily. The Carters had just moved into a charming house at the edge of the town, excited to spend their first Christmas in their new home. Little did they know that this Christmas Eve would mark the beginning of a horrifying nightmare that no one could have ever predicted. The evening started off like any other Christmas Eve. The Carters had just finished dinner, roast turkey, mashed potatoes, and all the trimmings, and were gathered in the living room to relax. Emily, the youngest, was particularly excited. She had been eagerly waiting for Christmas morning when she could finally open her presents. But as the night went on, something felt off. As the evening stretched into the late hours, the parents started to clean up. They called for Emily to come say goodnight before bed. But when they checked her room, she was nowhere to be found. Panic set in immediately as they frantically searched the house. Emily's toys were scattered around the living room, her little shoes neatly placed by the front door, but she was missing. The parents, now desperate, called the police. They immediately began combing the neighborhood. It was a cold night, with a thick layer of snow covering the ground. But no sign of Emily. As hours passed with no leads, the family became increasingly frantic. And then, they found something. On Emily's bed beneath the pillow was a note written in red ink. The handwriting was childish, but unnervingly precise. The note read, "I'll be waiting for you under the Christmas tree." It sent a chill through their veins. The family rushed into the living room, their hearts pounding with fear. Could this be some kind of sick joke? A prank? But the note felt too real, too sinister. The family went to the Christmas tree, searching frantically. The tree, usually a symbol of warmth and joy, now felt like a grotesque reminder of the terror that had just begun. They searched every inch of the tree, under the gifts, behind the ornaments, and even beneath the tree skirt. But there was nothing. Then, from the corner of the room, they heard something, a creaking sound, as if someone was slowly moving in the attic above. The family was frozen in place. What was that noise? Why hadn't they noticed it earlier? They stood in silence, waiting to hear another sound. And there it was again. Footsteps. The family, too terrified to wait, grabbed a flashlight and ran up to the attic. They opened the door, only to find Emily sitting on the floor, her eyes wide with fear. She wasn't crying, but there was an expression on her face that the parents would never forget, complete, unfiltered terror. She didn't remember how she had gotten there, or what had happened. The police found no evidence of anyone being in the house, and no traces of any intruder. The only thing they could not explain was Emily's disappearance, and how she ended up in the attic. The family moved away shortly after, unable to shake the horrifying memory of what had happened. Every Christmas, the parents would look at the tree and wonder if the figure who left the note was still watching, waiting for another chance to claim someone in their home. It was a cold Christmas Eve in a quiet, small town in the Midwest, known for its tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. The Johnson family, who had lived there for years, were getting ready for a cozy night of Christmas traditions. They were nestled around their fireplace, wrapping the last presents and enjoying each other's company. The atmosphere was warm, and the scent of roasted chestnuts filled the air. Little did they know, the night would end with a chill far colder than the winter wind outside. As the night deepened, the father, Mark, was finishing the last of the holiday chores, putting up the stockings, checking the fire, and making sure everything was in place. But as he sat down to join his family by the fire, there was a sudden knock at the door. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting. Mark figured it might be a neighbor stopping by, or perhaps one of the local kids playing a Christmas prank. But as he approached the door, he felt a strange sensation in his stomach, a growing sense of unease. He opened the door, only to find no one standing on the porch. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind, but when he looked down, there was something on the ground, a single piece of twisted dark ribbon, as if it had been dropped deliberately. Strange, Mark thought, but shrugged it off. What happened next would leave them shaken for weeks. As Mark closed the door and turned to walk back inside, he heard soft footsteps from the porch. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the sound grew louder. He froze. The steps were slow, deliberate. They were coming closer. The door rattled as if someone was trying to open it from the outside. The family, alarmed, gathered around the door, peeking through the small window beside it. And that's when they saw him, the figure standing at the edge of the porch. He was tall, his face shadowed by the brim of a wide hat. His clothes were ragged, and his body seemed almost unnaturally still. He didn't speak, just stood there, staring at the Johnson family from behind the door. Mark, terrified but trying to keep his cool, stepped back, locked the door, and turned to his wife, eyes wide in fear. The figure didn't leave. It remained there, standing motionless on the porch. Every time they looked through the window, he was just standing there, waiting. And then, in an instant, just as they turned to call the police, the figure disappeared. There was no trace, no footsteps in the snow. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The Johnsons never found out who or what it was, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something evil had visited them that night. They moved away a few months later, and though they never spoke of it again, that Christmas Eve would haunt them forever. In the heart of the Pacific Northwest, in a town that rarely saw sunlight during the winter months, the Stevens family had just moved into their dream home. A grand, Victorian house with towering ceilings, beautiful chandeliers, and an antique charm that made it seem like it was straight out of a Christmas story. But little did they know, this Christmas would mark the beginning of an eerie haunting that would turn their holiday spirit into something terrifying. The Stevens family spent their first Christmas decorating the massive tree that stood in their living room. It was the centerpiece of their home, a magnificent pine tree adorned with sparkling lights, red ribbons, and hand-painted ornaments. Everything seemed perfect, but soon strange things began to happen. Every night, as the family gathered around the tree, the lights would flicker, dim, and then go out completely. At first, they thought it was just a wiring issue, something common in older homes. But when they replaced the light bulbs and checked the circuits, nothing changed. The lights continued to behave erratically. Then came the first real sign that something was wrong. One night, as they sat around the tree, the ornaments began to shake and fall, as if invisible hands were knocking them off one by one. The air turned cold, despite the warmth from the fire, and the family's dog, usually calm, started barking at the tree, growling at something none of them could see. One night, as the Stevens family sat together, the temperature dropped dramatically. The room was freezing, even with the fire burning brightly. The tree's lights flickered again, and suddenly, they went out completely. The family was plunged into darkness, their breath visible in the air. As they fumbled to turn on the lights, a loud crashing sound echoed from the living room. Rushing to the scene, they found the entire tree had toppled over, its ornaments shattered on the floor. But there was no sign of what had caused it. That's when they saw it. Standing at the far corner of the room, a figure in the shadows, its face obscured by a dark hood. The family's blood ran cold as they realized the figure wasn't just an illusion, it was real. It was standing there, watching them silently, before slowly disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind a chilling silence. The Stevens family didn't stay in that house for long. They packed up and left within the next few days, never to return. They never spoke of the ghostly figure or the terrifying occurrences around the Christmas tree. To this day, no one knows who or what was haunting their home, but the Stevens family would never forget the nightmare that Christmas brought. Christmas carolers bring joy to many people, singing festive songs and spreading cheer. But in one suburban neighborhood, carolers brought something far more sinister than song. For the Watson family, a night of holiday joy quickly became a nightmare they couldn't escape. The Watson had just finished their Christmas dinner and were lounging by the fire, enjoying the holiday. The snow outside fell softly, creating a serene winter scene. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Expecting to see some familiar faces, they opened it to find no one. But from the distance, they could hear the faint sound of a Christmas carol being sung, Jingle Bells, to be exact. The family thought it was just some carolers moving down the street, but when they closed the door, the singing grew louder. It wasn't coming from the street anymore. It was coming from directly outside their house. The Watson felt uneasy, but when they looked out the window, they saw nothing. No one was there. As they continued to listen, the singing grew more distorted, almost unnatural. The voices, though once cheerful, began to sound hollow and eerie, as if they were coming from a place far beyond the living. Then, without warning, the door creaked open by itself. As they stepped outside, the Watson were met with a chilling sight. Standing in the snow, just a few feet away, were figures, strange, gaunt figures dressed in tattered clothing, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They were singing Silent Night, but the words were coming out in a haunting, guttural tone. The family felt their hearts race with fear. Terrified, they rushed inside, slamming the door behind them. The carolers continued to sing for a moment longer, then faded into the night. The Watson never saw them again, but the memory of those eerie voices and the unsettling sight of the carolers stayed with them long after that Christmas night.